In 1970, the film Waterloo was released. An Italian-Soviet production, this historical epic focused on the eponymous battle and the two characters who defined its place in history: French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte and his adversary, the Duke of Wellington. The film follows Napoleon from his abdication after his disastrous Russian campaign in 1814, right until the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. For a more detailed breakdown of this film and its elements, I highly recommend History Buff's excellent video on the 1970 film, which I'll link in the description. But for now, I just want to give a brief overview and talk about an important lesson that I've learned recently. Throughout Waterloo, we, the audience, are with Napoleon on each step of his journey. His exile in Elba, his return to France, his preparation for war, his final battle, and then his departure to St. Helena. We spend 2 hours with this character, learning a lot about him over the relatively short period of his life. We learn about his flaws, his virtues, and we get to see one of history's most important, impactful, and incredible military tacticians of all time brought to life in a dignified and spectacular fashion. What I admire most about this film is that it avoids the temptation to do too much. After all, Napoleon and Wellington to some degree are massively documented and commented on figures. There is a lot to unpack with these men, and many directions in which the film could have gone, but Sergei Bondarchuk plays his card very effectively, even if he takes a few liberties here and there. The film is still visually stunning to this day, but we also get very invested into the characters. We learn their traits and skills. We get a strong sense of what made Napoleon such a feared military commander and why his men loved him so much, and why he's still very much venerated in French society today. The scope of the film is limited to the War of the Seventh Coalition, and it fits perfectly with everything it's trying to achieve. And this brings me on to a larger point of today's main video. This week I went to see Ridley Scott's Napoleon. As an avid history buff and someone who studied about the Napoleonic histories at university, I was eager to see which direction Scott went in. Bondarchuk focused on Napoleon's final campaign. Perhaps Scott would look at the other wars of the coalition, or perhaps the French Revolution. Maybe he would explore the power politics between the European empires, or take a more intimate look at Napoleon's relationship with Josephine. The answer was all of the above. Despite the limitations of a 2.5-hour runtime, Scott attempted to address almost every aspect of Napoleon's life and personality. The result was something very disappointing for me overall that paled in comparison to its 1970s predecessor. I left the theatre not really knowing anything more about Napoleon as a tactician, a man, a husband, or an emperor. The film rushed and convulsed through almost 20 years of history and politics and relationships. Almost all of the characters were underdeveloped or stereotyped. I didn't care about what happened to any of them because none of them had been consistent or spent enough time with me on screen. The dialogue was extremely modern and subpar for a Ridley Scott film that shares the same director who produced lines like,
"You find yourself alone, riding in green fields with the sun on your face. Do not be troubled, for you are in Elysium, and you're already dead!"
This is Ripley. Last survivor of the Nostromo. Signing off.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched sea beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate.
That's not to mention the enormous gaps in context and consistency, such as the Duke of Wellington stating that they needed to deal with Napoleon and should have done so before, as if there hadn't been 6 coalitions that had tried for the past 12 years. Not once were we shown how Napoleon arguably won over 50 battles due to his tactical and strategic mastery. Instead, we are treated to him brooding on his battlefield, whining like a dog, grunting like a pig, or staring silently at his wife over a goblet of wine. At one moment in the film, he announces that he was destined for a lamb chop and that he disliked the British because they have boats. I laughed at this film a number of times, and I don't think it wanted me to. Now, I'm not a film reviewer, so I'd recommend you check out whichever review you trust, but let's just say the reaction hasn't been great overall. The point is that there is an egregious waste of potential here, and while I commend Scott for trying to do a lot, it clearly caused dialogue, character development, and key elements of Napoleon's life to be omitted or skimmed over. I kept thinking throughout the film, where was Napoleon's famous memory? Why was his hand never in his pocket? Why has no one mentioned Trafalgar or Spain or Bernadotte's betrayal? The litany of historical errors may be just something that I noticed because I've studied the history, but it felt like it all came from the same place, trying to do way too much in way too little time. However, there was something valuable that I've learned from this experience that I want to pass on to you that can help with your writing. That is, that it is much better for your narrative, character development, and reader enjoyment if you keep your story focused and streamlined. Don't try to do too much or cram in excessive amounts of details or events, even if you have lots that you can talk about. Waterloo works because the time frame is narrowed and clearly defined. We as an audience know what to expect. We know where we are going, and we can have a more intimate and knowledgeable journey there without breaking all the consistency rules. Napoleon tries to do everything, and it leaves it being messy, inconsistent, and ironically very funny in places. For books, we have a little grace here, as book lengths can vary, and there are a range of readers who will make choices based on that. However, once they get into the story, you can't just lurch from event to event, skip important details, or be cavalier with your story just because you want to cram in as many things as possible. It doesn't matter how big the book is, the story must fit inside it tightly and neatly, or the experience is unsatisfying and disappointing for your reader. Napoleon would have worked much better as a trilogy or a miniseries so that we could have actually had some time to let events and characters breathe and develop organically. Waterloo has a lot of tension in the build-up to the battle because we are seeing all the preparation. The odds are made explicit, the stakes are high, and the entire film has led to the event that most of us know how it will end. But because we spent a good amount of time with Napoleon over a relatively short period of his life, we are still almost rooting for him as he enters the battle, and we understand how formidable and dangerous he is as a military commander. Napoleon has none of that as we enter the Battle of Waterloo, because of how much time we've spent on so many other things, as the audience doesn't feel the impending doom or the desperation of the battle. We don't have a sense of the stakes or the ramifications. We don't have any sense of the personal connection with Napoleon, and that hurts the film massively. An extreme example even struck me too, that Napoleon Total War, a game that came out over 10 years ago, has an introduction video that tells me more about the character of Napoleon in about 1 minute than the film of over 2 hours. If you want to see a great example of how to keep things very narrow and focused, and how it can be successful, then look no further than the game's introduction. On top of that, it doesn't demean the character like the film, but builds him up to be an intimidating and masterful strategist, as is the general historical consensus. Does it cover everything about his life? Of course not. But does it need to? You don't have to use everything that's available to you to make a good story and a hooking narrative. Just use what is needed to tell a narrative that is clear and interesting. Keep things defined and focused, and your story and your readers will thank you for it.
Now they say nothing. They fear me, like a force of nature, a dealer in thunder and death. I say, I am Napoleon. I am Emperor.